The day Lewis Barker rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, he did not say a single word, and yet somehow, by nightfall, every soul in town had already formed an opinion about him. He came in from the South Trail, his horse a lean buckskin mare with a white blaze down her nose, his saddle worn to a shine at the seat, and pommel from years of long rides across open country. He was broad across the shoulders, lean at the hip, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been cut from sandstone and left out in the weather for a decade. His hat was dark brown, battered at the brim, and he wore it pulled low over eyes the color of river-bottom clay after a good rain, brown and deep and still. He did not nod to the men on the boardwalk. He did not tip his hat to the women who paused near the dry goods store to watch him pass. He simply rode to the livery stable at the north end of town, dismounted with the ease of a man who has been doing the same thing since childhood, and led his mare inside without once opening his mouth. Hank Drury, who ran the livery, talked enough for any two men in a room, and he did not notice for a full 3 minutes that Lewis had not responded to a single one of his questions. He had been asking about the mare's temperament, about where the stranger had ridden in from, about whether he planned to stay overnight or push on in the morning, and all he had received in return was a steady nod here, a slight shake of the head there, and once, when he asked directly whether the horse had thrown a shoe on the south road, a calm and deliberate finger pointed at the mare's left rear hoof. Hank looked. Sure enough, the shoe was loose. He grunted in respect. "You a quiet one," Hank said, and Lewis looked at him with those river mud eyes and gave a single, unhurried nod. That was how Caldwell first met Lewis Barker. By supper time, 3 different men at the Dusty Rail Saloon had heard from Hank that the new cowboy in town was either a mute by nature, a mute by some old injury, or possibly a man with a dark past who simply chose silence over the risk of saying the wrong thing. None of them were entirely wrong, as it would turn out, but only one of them was right in the way that mattered. Lewis Barker had not spoken a word in 11 years. Not since the fever that took his voice somewhere in the winter of 1868, when he was 19 years old and driving cattle through a storm in Missouri that no trail boss should have pushed a crew into. The fever had burned through the camp like fire through dry grass, and when Lewis came out the other side of it lighter by 15 pounds, hollow-eyed and shaking, his voice simply was not there anymore. The doctor in the nearest town had looked at his throat and shrugged with the particular helplessness of a man who has reached the limit of his knowledge. He had told Lewis that the vocal cords looked undamaged, that sometimes these things resolved on their own, and that sometimes they did not. They had not. What Lewis had instead was a small leather-bound notebook he kept in his breast pocket, a stub of pencil tucked behind his ear, and a handwriting that was surprisingly clean and deliberate for a man whose hands spent most of their hours gripping rope and saddle leather. He had learned to communicate with economy, a single word where other men used 10. A clear sentence where other men used a paragraph. After 11 years of silence, Lewis Barker had become, in a strange and quiet way, one of the most precise communicators in the whole of the Kansas territory. He simply did it without sound. He took a room above the dry goods store, paying Mrs. Albright, who ran the boarding house next door, a month's rent in advance with coins from a leather pouch, handing her a folded note that said, "1 room. Quiet is preferred. I do not speak. I will not be trouble." She had stared at the note for a moment, then looked up at him with the frank and unsentimental gaze of a woman who had seen enough of life's peculiarities not to be ruffled by one more, and nodded. She had the room at the top of the stairs with the window that faced east, she told him, and it got good morning light. He had nodded his thanks and carried his saddlebag up without being told which door was his. It was the following morning that he first saw Lucy Crawford. He heard her before he saw her, which was, as he would later understand, the natural order of things with Lucy Crawford. She was standing outside the hardware store 3 doors down from the boarding house, speaking with old Mr. Garrett, who was 72 and partially deaf, and she was telling him in a warm, bright, carrying voice that cut through the morning air like a bell, that his display of hinges in the window was blocking the view of the prettier items behind, and that if he moved the hinge display to the left, the decorative ironwork from Santa Fe would catch the morning light and draw twice the customers. Mr. Garrett was nodding vigorously, clearly delighted to have been noticed at all, and Lucy was already moving on to the next point, which was that the step outside his door had a loose board, and she had nearly twisted her ankle on it 2 days running, and so had Mrs. Purdy, who was not the suing kind but whose husband was. Lewis had paused on the boardwalk to watch. Not because she was telling the old man how to run his shop. She was not unkind about it. She was genuinely enthusiastic, as though the correct placement of hinges was one of the most interesting problems she had encountered that week. He watched because of the way she moved when she talked. She was 24, he would learn, with dark chestnut hair that she wore partially pinned and partially loose in a way that suggested she had started the morning tidy and then gotten distracted before she finished. She was not tall, but she held herself like she was, chin up, shoulders back, gesturing with her hands in big, expressive arcs that seemed to involve her whole upper body. Her dress was a practical deep blue wool, the kind a woman wore when she expected to do real work, and she had ink stains on her right thumb and forefinger that she had clearly given up trying to scrub away. She was beautiful in the way that certain people are beautiful without seeming to know it or much care, not because she was trying to be noticed, but because everything about her was so fully and completely itself that looking at her was like looking at something genuine in a world full of imitations. Lewis realized he had stopped walking. He made himself start again. He did not speak to her that day. He had no reason to, and he was not the kind of man who invented reasons. But he noticed, over the next several days as he began working at the Dunmore Ranch 4 miles outside of town, because Luther Dunmore had been looking for a steady hand, and Lewis was as steady as they came, that Lucy Crawford was someone you could not be in Caldwell and not eventually know. She was everywhere. She ran the town's small lending library, which was really just 2 bookcases in the back of the general store that she had organized and cataloged herself. She wrote for the Caldwell Weekly Courier, articles about local matters, about the cattle trade, about the water rights disputes that were beginning to simmer between the smaller homesteaders and the big ranch operations to the north. She taught reading twice a week in the evenings to the adults who had never learned, most of them former soldiers or immigrants who had come west with ambition and without schooling. She brought soup to the sick without being asked. She argued passionately and at length with anyone who would hold still long enough to argue with her about anything from local politics to the proper way to mend a fence line. She talked to everyone in Caldwell. She talked to the men at the saloon and the women at the church auxiliary and the children who ran in the street and the Cheyenne traders who came through twice a year with their ponies and their goods. And to these last she spoke with a respect that not everyone in town shared, and that Lewis, who had ridden enough country to know that the Cheyenne and every other nation of people who had been on this land long before anyone called it Kansas, had been treated with a profound and continuing injustice, quietly appreciated. The treaties had been broken so many times that the paper they were written on was a joke, and the reservation system was a cruelty dressed up in government language, and Lucy Crawford was one of the very few people in Caldwell who seemed to understand that and to say so out loud, which was not always popular but which Lewis thought was right. She talked to everyone, and Lewis said nothing to anyone, and for 3 weeks they occupied the same small town and knew each other only by sight. Then the library happened. Lewis had come into the general store on a Tuesday evening for tobacco and flour, and he had noticed the 2 bookcases in the back, and he had stood in front of them longer than he had intended, because it had been a long time since he had been near books. He had taken down a volume of Dickens' Bleak House, specifically, and was reading the first page standing up, which was how he read whenever he was somewhere he had not expected to read, when he heard her voice. "That one's very long," Lucy said, coming around the end of the shelf with a notebook under her arm and an expression of cheerful authority. "I'm not saying that to discourage you. I just think people should be warned so they can make a fully informed decision." He looked up at her. She was looking at the book in his hands, not at him, cataloging something in her notebook with a stub of pencil that was almost identical to the one behind his own ear. "Have you read it?" she asked, glancing up. He nodded. "More than once." He held up 2 fingers. Her eyebrows went up in a way that was clearly pleased rather than surprised. "It's better the second time, isn't it? You know where you're going, so you can pay attention to how he got there." She tilted her head. "Are you the new hand at Dunmore's? Lewis, is it?" He nodded again. "I'm Lucy Crawford," she said, and she held out her hand with the frankness of someone who did not consider gender a reason to skip introductions. He shook it. Her grip was firm and real. "I run the library, which is maybe a grand word for what it actually is, but I'm working on that. Are you looking to borrow that one, or were you just visiting it?" He pulled the pencil from behind his ear, opened the small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote quickly, "Borrowing if that's allowed. I'll bring it back in good condition." He turned the notebook so she could read it. She did. Her expression did not change in the way some people's expressions changed when they realized he did not speak, the brief discomfort, the exaggerated slowness with which they then chose their own next words, as though he were a child who had not understood something. She simply nodded businesslike and said, "Of course it's allowed. That's what libraries are for. I just need your name for my register." He wrote, "Lewis Barker." And then, because she had been straightforward with him, he added, "I don't speak. I had a fever years ago. It's permanent." She read that too, and then looked up at him with the same direct brown eyes that she turned on everything and said, "All right. Well, I talk enough for most of the county anyway, so between us, we'll probably manage fine." He almost smiled. It happened fast and was gone before it fully arrived, but she caught it. He saw her catch it in the slight brightening of her own expression, and she turned back to her catalog without remarking on it, which he appreciated more than she knew. He borrowed Bleak House. He read it again over the course of 2 weeks, coming into the general store on 3 occasions to trade notes with Lucy, literally trade notes, in that she would say something and he would write a response. And somehow, against any reasonable expectation, this became a conversation that neither of them seemed to want to end. She had opinions about Dickens that were strong and specific and sometimes wrong, and he found that writing back to her took more time than speaking would have because he wanted to get the arguments right, wanted to say exactly what he meant without the filler that most people used when they talked, and the result was that his responses to her were more considered and more precise than most spoken conversation tended to be. She noticed this. "You write the way good lawyers argue," she told him one evening, reading a note he had written about the moral architecture of the novel. "No wasted words, everything on purpose." She looked up. "I envy that, actually. I always use 3 words when one would do." He wrote back, "The 3 words are usually the interesting ones." She laughed, loud and unguarded, the kind of laugh that made everyone in the store look up. She seemed entirely unbothered by this. He found, to his own mild amazement, that he liked being the cause of it. The spring deepened towards summer, and Lewis settled into the rhythm of the Dunmore ranch with the ease of a man who had been doing range work his whole adult life. He was good at it, good in the way that quiet people are sometimes good at physical work, because all the attention that other men divided between talking and doing, he gave entirely to doing. Luther Dunmore, who was 54 and had employed every kind of cowhand in his 2 decades of ranching in Kansas, told his wife Margaret at the end of Lewis's first month that the mute hand was worth 2 of the talkers he had kept on through the winter. Margaret Dunmore, who was the kind of woman who wanted to understand people she was going to have regular dealings with, had asked at supper one night whether Lewis had ever been in love, and Lewis, who had been passing the bread at the time, had paused and then written carefully on his notepad. "Not until I came to Caldwell," and passed it to her without looking at Luther, who fortunately was at the other end of the table. Margaret had read it and gone very still, and then looked at him with an expression that mixed warmth and concern in equal measure, and had said quietly, "She's a remarkable woman, Louis." He had simply taken the bread back and buttered it. It was in early June that things between Louis and Lucy took a shape that was harder to look away from, and it happened because of the Courier. Lucy's editor, a man named Gerald Fitch, who owned the paper, and had the editorial courage of a man who had carefully calculated exactly how much controversy he could sustain without losing advertisers, had refused to run her article about the water rights situation. The article, which Louis had read in draft form because Lucy had asked him to look at it, a habit they had developed where she used him as a reader because, as she said, he was the only person in town whose feedback she could trust not to be filtered through either wanting to please her or wanting to avoid her, was thorough, factual, and damning to 3 of the larger ranch operations, including, peripherally, Dunmore's. She had documented the way that the upstream ranches were diverting creek water in ways that left the smaller homesteaders, several of them families with children, without reliable water access through the dry summer months. Fitch had told her it would make enemies, and she had told him that making enemies was sometimes what the truth did, and he had told her that was a fine sentiment for a person who did not need the advertising revenue from the Carlisle Ranch and the Hooper operation to keep a paper running, and she had told him that a paper that would not print the truth was just expensive wallpaper. Louis had been standing outside the Courier office when she came out of it, which was not coincidence. He had seen her go in with that expression she wore when she was bracing for a fight, and he had decided to be in the vicinity in case she needed someone to hand a note to. She came out with her jaw set and her color high and her notebook clutched in both hands like she was considering throwing it at something. She saw him and stopped. "He killed it," she said. He nodded once. He had expected this. She looked at him for a moment, then sat down on the bench outside the Courier office with an abruptness that suggested her legs had made the decision while her head was still catching up. He sat down beside her. "Those families need water," she said. It was not an argument. She was not trying to convince him of anything. She was just saying the thing out loud the way people sometimes needed to say a thing that was true and heavy. "The Hatcher family has 4 children and their creek has been running at a third of normal volume since March because someone upstream put in a secondary channel. I've seen it. I've measured it. I wrote it down and Fitch won't run it." He took out his notebook and wrote, "Then we print it somewhere else." She turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" He wrote, "There's a press in Wichita, and a man named Calhoun who runs a reform paper. I've read his work. He'd run it." She stared at the note for a long moment, and he watched her face move through several things, surprised that he knew about Calhoun, consideration of whether it was feasible, the particular excitement of a person who has found a new door where they thought there was only a wall. "How do you know about Henry Calhoun?" she asked. He wrote, "I read. And I've been through Wichita." She looked at him, really looked, in a way that was different from how she had looked before. Not the directness of her everyday manner, which was applied to everyone and everything with equal energy. This was something more focused and more personal, like she was seeing the shape of him for the first time rather than just the surface. "Louis Barker," she said slowly, as though she were trying the name out. "You know more than you let on." He wrote, "I let on plenty. I just do it quietly." She read it and then slowly smiled. Not the quick, bright social smile she turned on the world, but something quieter and more private, like a candle rather than a lantern. It did something to his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, a kind of pressure that was not entirely unpleasant, like the air before a thunderstorm when you can smell the rain coming, but it has not yet arrived. They rode to Wichita 3 weeks later. It was not entirely appropriate for an unmarried woman to ride 50 miles alone with a man who was not her relation, and Lucy had acknowledged this with a cheerfulness that suggested she had considered it for about 30 seconds before deciding that the water rights of the Hatcher family and 4 others outweighed the proprieties, and that anyone who wanted to argue about it was welcome to try. She had told her neighbor Mrs. Finch where she was going and why, and had invited Mrs. Finch to come along as a chaperone, and Mrs. Finch had declined on the grounds that her back could not manage a long ride, and had then told Lucy to be careful and bring her back some good news, which was essentially the whole of Caldwell's attitude toward Lucy Crawford's occasional refusals to follow convention. The ride to Wichita took 2 days, with a night camp near the Arkansas River, and Lewis understood that this was one of those situations where the careful arrangement of practical things could stand in for the things that were harder to say. He set up a camp that was clean and separate. He built a fire that was large enough to be comfortable and visible. He made sure she had the better sleeping position sheltered from the wind, closer to the warmth, and he cooked. He was a good camp cook, which surprised her. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, watching him manage the pan with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. He wrote, "Long time on the trail. You either learn to make it good or you spend years eating badly." "What kind of work have you done before Dunmore's?" he wrote, taking a little more time with it than usual. "Cattle drives mostly. Kansas-Colorado route. Some time in New Mexico Territory. I worked a season at a horse ranch in Oklahoma Territory. Before that, Missouri and Arkansas." She was quiet for a moment, reading then. "Have you always been alone?" It was a frank question, and he expected nothing less from her. He wrote, "Mostly. It's easier when you don't speak. People don't know what to do with you at first. After a while they either stop noticing or they leave." She read it, and he watched her absorb it in that particular way she had of receiving information fully, without flinching, turning it over before responding. "People in Caldwell notice you," she said. "They just haven't figured out what to say about it yet." He wrote, "And you?" She looked up from the paper. "I figured it out after about 10 minutes, she said. "You say exactly what you mean. That's rarer than people think." He looked at the fire for a moment, then wrote one more line and passed the notebook to her. "So do you. That's also rarer than people think." She read it and was quiet for a long moment, which was, for Lucy Crawford, its own kind of eloquence. They reached Wichita on a warm Thursday afternoon, and Henry Calhoun of the Western Reform Courier turned out to be a small, energetic man in his 50s, with ink permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, and the eager eyes of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of article for years. He read Lucy's piece standing up, leaning over his own press desk, making small sounds of approval and the occasional emphatic tap of his finger on the page. He agreed to run it in the following week's issue. He also offered Lucy a monthly column. She came out of the Courier office in Wichita with the same energy with which she had come out of the Caldwell one, but this time it was the energy of something expanding rather than something closed, and she looked at Lewis standing on the street with his hat in his hands and his expression patient and steady as it always was, and she said, "He said yes to everything. He wants a column, every month." And then she did something that surprised both of them. She closed the 3 feet between them in one quick step and hugged him, properly and completely, both arms around his chest and her head briefly against his shoulder. He went very still. He was not a man who was touched often, had not been for years, and the sudden reality of it, her solidity and warmth, the smell of road dust and something floral in her hair moved through him like a sound through still water, spreading out in every direction at once. She stepped back almost immediately, color in her cheeks, and said with characteristic directness, "Sorry, that was presumptuous." He shook his head. He reached for his notebook and wrote, with hands that were entirely steady because he had willed them to be, "Do not apologize." She read it and looked at him, and the color in her cheeks did not entirely fade. They had supper at a restaurant in Wichita, a real restaurant with tables covered in cloth and a menu written on a chalkboard, and Lewis ordered by pointing and Lucy ordered by speaking enough for both of them, and managed to find out, in the process, that their server had come from Ohio, that the cook was a woman named Rosa from Sonora, Mexico, and that the restaurant had been in business for 3 years but was having trouble with the supplier of their coffee. which Lucy said was a solvable problem, and offered 3 suggestions before they had been seated for 5 minutes. Lewis watched all of this with an affection that he recognized as having moved, somewhere in the past several weeks, from enjoyment to something considerably more dangerous. On the ride home, on the second day, she asked him directly. They had been riding for about 2 hours in a comfortable silence. She was not a person who needed to fill all silence, which he appreciated. She simply chose not to when she was thinking, when she said, without preamble, "Lewis, have you, is there anyone that you?" She stopped and made a sound of frustration with herself. "I'm usually better at just saying things. I'm going to try again." He waited. "Are you interested in me?" she said. "Not in a general way. I mean specifically." He was quiet for a moment. That was purely internal, not hesitation about the answer, which he knew exactly, but consideration of what the answer meant and what it would set in motion. Then he reached for his notebook and wrote and passed it to her without slowing his horse. She read it while riding, which was a small feat of horsemanship that he had not expected her to manage. He had written, "Yes, in a way I don't have good words for," which is saying something since words are all I have. She read it twice. He watched her face from the corner of his eye, the way she went still, the way she breathed in slowly through her nose, the way her hand steadied on the reins. "Well," she said at last, in a voice that was slightly less composed than her usual one, "that's the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." He wrote, "That wasn't difficult. You deserve better." She read that one and laughed, and the laugh was the good one, the unguarded one, and it carried out over the open Kansas grassland and then faded into the huge and indifferent sky. And Lewis Barker thought that he had never in his life heard a sound so precisely like the feeling of something opening. They returned to Caldwell in the early evening, and Mrs. Finch came out to her porch and asked Lucy how it had gone. And Lucy told her it had gone very well on every count, and said this with a warmth in her voice and a glance in Lewis's direction that Mrs. Finch registered with the thoroughness of a woman who paid attention to things and said nothing about. What followed was a summer of small and deliberate steps, which was the only kind of steps Lewis Barker knew how to take, and which suited Lucy Crawford rather more than she might have predicted, since her usual approach to things was at speed, and her instinct was to charge at whatever interested her and sort out the details afterward. But there was something in Lewis's specific and considered manner, the way he showed up, reliable as weather patterns, the way he chose his words on paper, the way another man might choose which path to take across uncertain ground, that slowed her in ways she found she did not mind. He began walking her home from the lending library on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. This was easy to justify as practical. It was sometimes past 9 when she finished, and the stretch from the general store to her small house on Macon Street past the saloon, and both of them knew perfectly well that it was not primarily about safety, and neither of them said so. He brought her things he had found. Not gifts in the conventional sense. He did not bring her flowers or ribbons or the small manufactured trinkets that had made their way out to the frontier in traveling merchants' cases. He brought her a hawk feather he had found near the South Creek, which she put on her desk where she wrote. He brought her a piece of limestone from the bluffs east of town in which he had noticed the shape of a small ancient shell, pressed into the stone like a memory, which she held for a long time and then put on her windowsill. He brought her once a folded newspaper from Santa Fe that had an article in it about a woman who had been appointed to run a territorial school board, and she unfolded it and read it with the focus and the pleasure of someone who has been handed exactly the thing they needed. She began to bring him things too, books she thought he had not read, with small notes tucked inside the front cover in her quick, ink-stained handwriting. Sometimes just sentences, page 47, "You'll want to argue with this, I can already tell," and sometimes more. Once she brought him a letter she had written to her sister in Ohio that she had decided not to send, because on rereading it she had realized the real thing she was trying to say was not in it, and she had handed it to him without explanation and let him read it, and he had understood without being told that she was showing him something she did not show people. The letter was about loneliness, not the acute loneliness of having no one around, but the quieter kind, the loneliness of being surrounded by people and conversations, and still feeling that the thing you were actually trying to say was not being heard. He had read it sitting at her kitchen table in the evening while she made coffee, and when she set the coffee down and sat across from him, he had written, "I know that kind." She had looked at the note and then at him for a long, very quiet moment and said, "I know you do. That's why I showed you." The article about the water rights ran in the Western Reform Courier and made its way, as things printed in newspapers tended to in 1879, into the conversations and arguments of people well beyond its immediate readership. A copy reached the county seat, and another reached a state legislator in Topeka who had been looking for exactly this kind of documented evidence to support a broader inquiry into water usage practices. Gerald Fitch at the Caldwell Courier, who had refused to run it, received enough inquiries about it from his own readership that he had the particular experience of being embarrassed by his own cowardice in front of his subscribers, which was the kind of consequence that Lucy had not specifically engineered, but could not entirely claim she had not foreseen. The Hatcher family's creek situation was eventually addressed as part of a broader county investigation, which resulted in the secondary channel being closed and a formal water rights arrangement being registered. Lucy wrote about this too, and Henry Calhoun ran it, and offered her a permanent position as a contributing correspondent, which she accepted with the condition that she could continue to live and write from Caldwell. Luther Dunmore, whose ranch had been referenced in the original article, had a conversation with Lewis about it that consisted mostly of Luther expressing his feelings about journalists in general and one journalist in particular, and Lewis listening, with the patience of a man who has no ability to interrupt and no inclination to if he did. At the end of it, Luther said, "I hear she's spending time with you," and Lewis nodded calmly, and Luther looked at him for a moment and said, "She's a pain in my backside professionally, but she's not wrong about the creek," and Lewis nodded again, and Luther made a sound that was about 3/4 acknowledgement and 1/4 respect and walked back to the barn. It was in late August that Lewis wrote the note that changed everything. He had been sitting with it for weeks. It was not a complicated sentence, 5 words, one of which was her name. He had written it in his notebook, looked at it, and closed the notebook again more times than he would have admitted to anyone. He was not afraid of much, had not been for a long time. The frontier had a way of burning unnecessary fears out of you, but this was different. This was not the kind of thing that could be walked back or quietly amended. He had learned in 11 years of written communication that there were certain words that, once written down and handed to someone, became a permanent part of the record. This was one of those. The evening he chose was a Tuesday after the library. They were walking down Macon Street in the warm end-of-summer dark, the air smelling of dry grass, and the faint mineral coolness that came off the plains at night when the day's heat finally let go. There was a full moon and it was generous with its light, and Lucy was telling him about a letter she had received from her sister, who was expecting her first child and had written that she was terrified and elated and barely sleeping. "I want to write back something useful," Lucy said. "Something that will actually help, not just be comforting, though I suppose sometimes being comforting is useful." She paused. "What do you think?" He reached for his notebook as they walked. He wrote, "Tell her that the being terrified and elated at the same time means she understands exactly what it is. People who only feel one of those are not paying attention." She read it while walking, which she did easily now, having practiced, and she said quietly, "Yes, that's exactly right. I'm going to write that." She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket, which was something she had started doing, keeping his notes rather than handing them back, and which he had noticed and not mentioned but had felt in a way that was not small. They reached her house. The porch light was burning, a small lamp she kept in the window when she expected to be out after dark. She turned to say good night the way she always did, and he reached into his breast pocket and took out not his everyday notebook but a different one, a folded single page he had torn out and written carefully in the full, clear pen rather than the stub pencil, and held it out to her. She looked at the paper, then at him. Something in the deliberateness of the gesture, the different paper, the pen rather than pencil, the slight change in his expression that was not quite an expression so much as the absence of his usual guardedness, told her this was different from the usual notes. She unfolded it. She read it once quickly and then again slowly. It said, "Lucy, I have been quiet my whole life, and I have learned that the right word said once is worth more than 100 wrong ones, so I will say this once clearly. I have loved you since before I knew it was happening, which is the only way I think love works when it is real. I do not know what you want or what you will say, and I will not pretend to. I only know that I am more myself near you than I have been since before I was silent, and that I wanted you to know it. You do not have to say anything now. You do not have to say anything at all. But I wanted you to have this, because you give everything away freely and someone should give something back." She stood on her porch in the moonlight and she read it a third time, and Louis stood at the bottom of the porch steps and watched the note in her hands, and the way the moonlight caught the angle of her jaw and the slight movement of her lips as she read, and he was very still, the way he was still when he was waiting for something that mattered. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. Not the brightness of her usual animated energy. This was the brightness of someone who has been reached somewhere they had not expected to be reached. That particular light that belongs to the moment when a feeling you thought you were carrying alone turns out to have a name, and a hand extended toward it. "Louis," she said, and her voice was different from its usual sure and clear and carrying quality. It was smaller and more careful, the way a person speaks when they are being honest about something for which they have no practiced words. He waited. "I have been talking to people my whole life," she said, "because talking is how I think and thinking is how I feel, and I have given a great deal of words to a great many people over the years, and I have not. She stopped and pressed her lips together for a moment. "I have not had very many given back to me, not like this." He looked at her. She came down the 2 porch steps until she was standing directly in front of him, very close, and she looked up at him in the moonlight with those direct, open, completely uncalculating brown eyes, and she said, "I love you too, Louis Barker. I think I have since you wrote back about Dickens, and I thought, oh, this is someone who is actually thinking, not just talking." He reached up and touched her face with the back of his fingers, very gently, and she turned her cheek slightly into it the way you turn toward warmth. And then she was close, and then they were closer, and he kissed her there on Macon Street in the August moonlight, and it was the kind of kiss that is also a conversation, the kind that says things that do not have words and do not need them. Mrs. Finch, who had been taking the air on her own porch across the street, turned tactfully inside and went to bed with a satisfaction that she would express to no one and feel for quite a long time. What followed in the autumn was a happiness of the specific and unhurried kind that grows in the ground rather than springs up overnight. It took root slowly and ran deep, and was not the sort that blew away in the first hard wind. Louis continued his work at Dunmore's, rising before dawn and riding out to the range in the early dark, and he continued to bring her things he found, and to read her drafts, and to walk her home on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Lucy continued her column for Henry Calhoun, continued the lending library, continued arguing with Fitch at the Caldwell Courier, who had begun to seem, over the months, slightly embarrassed in her presence, which she interpreted charitably as growth. They had a dinner at the Dunmore house in late September, the first time Louis had brought her to a meal with his employers, and Margaret Dunmore received Lucy with the warmth of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this, and had the good sense not to say so, and Luther received her with the resigned warmth of a man who had been prepared by his wife and was making the best of the situation, and by the end of the evening, he was talking to her directly about the water situation rather than around it, which Margaret took as a very positive sign and relayed to Lewis in a quiet moment in the kitchen by simply squeezing his arm and saying, "Good." In October, Gerald Fitch asked Lucy to come back to the Caldwell Courier on her terms, by which he meant he was now willing to print the kind of article he had refused to print before, which was either a change of heart or a response to market forces, and was possibly both. Lucy agreed, partly because she believed in the value of a local paper doing the thing it was supposed to do, and partly because she was practical enough to know that two publishing outlets paid better than one. She told Lewis about this over coffee at her kitchen table, which had become, gradually, and without either of them formally acknowledging it, one of their habitual meeting places. He was there most evenings that he was not needed at the ranch after dark, and she had started keeping coffee ready in a way that suggested she had stopped thinking of it as preparation and started thinking of it as expectation. He wrote, "Fitch is not my favorite person, but the town needs the paper, and you'll be better for having run the same piece in Wichita. He knows now that you don't need him." She read it and smiled. "That's very diplomatically put." He wrote, "I had a long time to think about what I was going to say." She laughed and shook her head and poured more coffee, and Lewis watched her in the warm lamplight of her small kitchen and felt the specific and profound peace of being exactly where you are supposed to be. He proposed to her in November. He had thought about how to do it for about 3 weeks and had discarded several approaches on the grounds that they were either too elaborate. He was not an elaborate man or too spare, which would not be right for her, who deserved something she could hold on to. He had finally settled on this. He came to the library on a Thursday evening at closing time and helped her put the books away, which he sometimes did, and when they were done and she was putting on her coat and he was standing near the door in the last of the lamp light, he took out a new notebook. He had bought it specifically, a nicer one than his usual, with dark leather covers and good paper, and he wrote on the first page and handed it to her. She opened it and read, and her hand went to her mouth. He had written on the first page, "This is yours if you want it. Everything in it is for you. Starting with this, Lucy Crawford, will you marry me?" And on the second page he had written, because he had planned for this, had thought about what he wanted to say if she opened the second page, which he thought she would, he had written, "I know I cannot speak your name out loud. I cannot say it the way you deserve to have it said, with a voice and a breath and all the sound of a person who loves you. But I have thought your name every morning for 7 months, and I will think it every morning for every year I am alive, and I think that is the same thing." She stood at the door of the lending library with the notebook in her hands and she cried, which was something she had not done in front of anyone in a very long time, and Lewis stepped forward and put his arms around her properly and held her, and she let herself be held, which was also something she did not often do. "Yes," she said against his shoulder. "Yes, obviously yes." He held her tighter. They were married in December of 1879 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, on a day that was cold and bright, the plains to the west dusted with a thin snow that caught the winter sun and threw it back in pieces. Lucy wore a dress that was dark green rather than white, because she was a practical woman and a dark green dress could be worn again, and she carried a small clutch of dried wildflowers that she had pressed herself in the late summer because she had thought then that she might want them, which was as close as she came to acknowledging that she had been planning this longer than the proposal. Lewis wore his best clothes, which Margaret Dunmore had assessed 2 weeks before and declared adequate but borderline, and had then accompanied him on a trip to the dry goods store where she had overseen the purchase of a good wool jacket, which he wore now over a clean white shirt that was, if not new, at least recently laundered. He had his boots polished to a mirror shine, which had taken an hour and which he had judged worth it. The church was full. Almost every person in Caldwell came, and several from outside it, including Henry Calhoun from Wichita, who came in a wagon with his wife and sat in the third row and wept unself-consciously at entirely the wrong moments, which Lucy found very charming. The Cheyenne Trader, a man named Running Wolf who came through Caldwell twice a year, and who had developed, over several visits, a relationship with Lucy based on her genuine respect for him and his people and her ability to trade honestly, had come through on schedule and learned of the wedding and had been formally invited. He sat at the back with two of his men and watched the proceedings with the dignified attention of someone who was filing it carefully for later consideration. The preacher, a man named Holloway who was used to the various eccentricities of the frontier and had married couples who spoke 6 different languages, and once a couple where only one party was present because the other had been delayed by a flash flood, and they had proceeded with a proxy. Preacher Holloway had asked Lewis in advance how they should manage the vows, and Lewis had written, "She should say hers aloud, and I will say mine by giving her this," and had included a folded page, and the preacher had read it and nodded and said he thought that would do fine. When the time came, Lucy said her vows clearly and without trembling in the voice that carried to the back of the church without effort, and then Preacher Holloway read Lewis's written vows aloud in his own voice, slowly and clearly, so that the whole congregation heard them. They were not long, because Lewis did not waste words, but they were so precisely chosen and so entirely themselves, promising her his full attention and his honest opinion, and his presence without qualification, and whatever small gifts a man who lived quietly could give, that by the time Holloway finished, half the women in the church were reaching for handkerchiefs, and Luther Dunmore was looking at the ceiling with an expression that meant he was not going to cry, but it was a close thing. Lewis put the ring on her finger. It was simple, a plain gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, because he had seen turquoise in New Mexico and had thought it looked like the sky just before sunrise, which was his favorite hour. She looked at it on her hand and then looked at him with the full weight of her attention, and he thought he had never in his life been looked at so completely. They were married, and Caldwell came outside into the December cold and threw grain and shouted, and someone fired a pistol into the air, which made Lewis's mare, tied outside the church, very annoyed but not dangerous. They moved into a house at the edge of town in the spring of 1880, a larger place than Lucy's rental on Macon Street, with 3 rooms and a proper kitchen and a long porch that faced the sunset, which Lewis had noted as a particular virtue, because he had a habit of sitting outside in the evening with the last light going, and now he could do it from his own porch, and she could sit beside him, talking or quiet depending on the evening. The life they built was, in its particulars, not unlike the lives around them on the Kansas frontier. There was work, there was weather, there was the constant management of 1,000 practical details, and also entirely unlike those lives, because it was shaped by them, by her abundance of words and his abundance of attention, and the strange and exact complementary fit of these two things. She wrote. She wrote the column for Calhoun. She wrote for Fitch. She began work on a longer piece about the legal status of water rights in the Kansas Territory that she hoped to submit to a press in Kansas City. She continued the lending library. She started a campaign to get the county to fund a proper school teacher and schoolhouse rather than depending on volunteers, and this campaign was eventually successful in 1881. She talked to everyone, as she had always done, but there was now a specific and particular person she came home to talk to who read everything she wrote and handed back notes in clear, economical handwriting that were never what she expected and always what she needed. He worked the ranch through the week and came home in the evenings and sat on the porch with her and read, and wrote to her in the notebook she still kept, the nice one from the proposal, which was now nearly full of his notes to her on every subject, responses to her articles, observations about the weather and the land, the occasional dry joke, and once, unprompted, a full page about what it had been like to be silent for 11 years, which was the most he had written about it since the night outside her house, and which she read at the kitchen table in the early morning while he was already gone to work, and which she had to sit still with for quite a long time before she could get up and go about her day. In the winter of 1880 she was pregnant. They both received this news with the specific and somewhat stunned quality of people who had discussed the possibility in the abstract and now found themselves in the concrete. And Lewis had gone very still in the way he went still when something moved him deeply, and then had written on a scrap of paper, not the nice notebook, just the first scrap he could find, which was the back of a delivery receipt from the dry goods store, the word, "Good," just that. One word in his clean, clear handwriting. Good. She had looked at it and laughed and cried at the same time, which she was discovering was something she did more readily than she had before. And he had held her face in his hands and looked at her with the full force of those river mud eyes, and she had thought, not for the first time, that a person who had no voice had never in her experience communicated so much. The pregnancy was not an easy one in the middle months. She was tired in ways she had not anticipated, and the column did not write itself, and there were days when she sat at her desk and stared at the blank page with a frustration that was unlike her usual friction with the world, which was generative. This was something more fundamental and more tiring. On these days, Lewis would come home and find her at the desk not writing, which was how he knew, and he would make supper without comment and bring her tea without being asked and sit with her in the evenings, and read aloud to her, which he could not do in the traditional sense, but which he did by holding a book between them on the porch and pointing at passages, and letting her read them aloud herself while he watched the words along with her. A shared reading that she came to love specifically because of the silence in which it happened. A son was born in September of 1881. They named him Samuel Lewis Barker, Samuel for her father who had died when she was 18 and whom she had missed every day since, and Lewis for his father, who was not dead but who was present in every quality the boy would carry from the first moment. He arrived in the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's absolute certainty about requiring everyone's full attention. Lewis held his son in the first hour of his life with the care of a man who understands that certain things are irreplaceable, and he looked at him for a long time, and then he looked at Lucy, who was exhausted and luminous in the way that women are after they have done something enormous, and he reached for his notebook with one hand, the other holding Samuel, and wrote with more difficulty than usual because of the angle 3 words. "He is perfect." She read it and said, "He really is," in a voice full of wonder and fatigue and love, and then she said, "Lewis," with a soft particular emphasis that she had developed for when she was saying his name in the way that was entirely separate from all the other names she said in the course of a given day. And he looked at her. And for a moment they were simply there together in the warm room with their new son between them and the September evening coming through the window. And no words of any kind were necessary or improved upon the moment. Samuel was a loud and enthusiastic child, who appeared to have inherited his mother's conviction that the world deserved to know what he was thinking at all times, and who also appeared to have inherited his father's gift for absolute stillness when something genuinely interested him. He would shout and run and demand and announce for long stretches, and then go entirely quiet over something small. A beetle on the porch step, the way a candle flame moved, the pages of a book laid open in front of him, with a focused and complete attention that made his parents look at each other across his head with the private smile of people who recognize something. He was a healthy, happy, noisy child, and he had, from very young, a matter-of-fact understanding that his father communicated differently from other fathers, because this was the first and primary fact of his world and not a deviation from it. He learned to read Lewis's notes before he was old enough for school, because Lewis had taught him, sitting together at the kitchen table in the evenings with Samuel in his lap and the notebook open. And there was something that Lucy found quietly remarkable about watching her son learn to read from a man who had turned writing into the most complete form of expression she had ever encountered. The years settled and moved in the way that good years do, not with the drama of the hard ones, but with the accumulation of ordinary things that, in their accumulation, become something large and permanent. They were 5 years into their life on the porch of the house at the edge of Caldwell, and Lucy's hair had more of the sun in it, and her reputation as a writer had grown past Caldwell and past Kansas. And Lewis had, with Luther Dunmore's backing and his own savings, purchased a small piece of land east of town, where he ran a modest horse operation. 3 mares and a stud horse, and the careful production of good working horses for the local ranch trade, which was work he loved and was naturally skilled at, and which required, as it happened, very little conversation. She continued to bring him things, and he continued to bring her things. This did not stop because they were married. The hawk feathers and the pieces of limestone and the newspaper articles from distant places continued. The books with notes inside. The occasional folded page that was not a note so much as a letter, the kind you wrote when there was something you needed to say that was too large for a note and too personal for an article. In 1884, their second child arrived. A daughter this time, and they named her Eleanor after Lewis's mother, who had died in the Missouri winter that had also taken his voice, and who he had not spoken of to Lucy until she was 6 months pregnant, and he had written about his mother in the notebook. A long, careful page about a woman who had been kind and strong and had smelled like cedar, and had read to him every night until he was old enough to be embarrassed about it, and then kept reading to him anyway, because she knew that the embarrassment was not the truth of it. Lucy had read this page 3 times and then asked if she could keep it separate, and he had torn it out carefully and given it to her, and she had put it in the box where she kept the things that mattered most, alongside the scrap of paper with the word good on it and the first note from the porch of Macon Street. Eleanor was a quieter child than Samuel, which surprised no one, and she had, from her earliest understanding of things, her father's quality of complete attention and her mother's complete fearlessness, which was a combination that was going to present interesting challenges as she grew older, and which both Lewis and Lucy could see clearly and were already, in their respective ways, preparing for. Caldwell itself changed around them in these years. The cattle trade that had made the town was beginning to shift as the open range gave way to fencing and farming, and the rough and transient population that had given the frontier towns their particular character, the trail hands passing through, the gamblers, the men and women living out from under their pasts, began to thin and settle or move on. Caldwell became more what it would always be, a real town rather than a stopping place, with a school and a proper courthouse, and a newspaper that now ran, under Lucy's regular influence, the kind of journalism that small-town papers in the previous era had largely avoided. Lewis, at 35, was older than most of the hands still working the full-range rides, and his horse operation gave him work that was better suited to a man building something permanent. He had a reputation among the ranchers in the county as someone who produced exceptional working horses, calm-tempered, well-broke animals that did exactly what they were supposed to do and no more, and the quiet of his operation was something the horses responded to. People brought their difficult horses to him sometimes, animals that had been mishandled or frightened into bad habits, and he would take them in for a few weeks and return them changed, not by anything dramatic, simply by extended exposure to a man who was never startled, never loud, never anything other than exactly what he was. Lucy wrote about this once, in an article that was not specifically about Lewis but which was ostensibly about horse handling practices, and which was, in fact, about what it meant to be still and present in a world that rewarded speed and noise. She did not show him the draft. She showed him the published version, placing the Caldwell Courier on the kitchen table folded to the page, and went out to the garden, because she wanted him to read it without her watching. He read it at the table with his coffee going cold beside him. It was a good piece, clear and specific and full of the things she always brought to her best work, which was a genuine curiosity about why people were the way they were and what that meant. It said, among other things, that the animals responded not to the absence of sound, but to the presence of honesty, that what calm horses were responding to was a person who had no gap between their inside and their outside, no discrepancy between what they felt and what they showed, and that this quality was rarer in people than in horses, and that both species were poorer for it. He sat with the paper for a long time after he finished reading it. Then he went out to the garden where she was pulling weeds from between the rows with her usual energetic efficiency, and he stood at the edge of the garden until she looked up, and when she did, he held up his hands in a small helpless gesture that was both "I don't know what to say" and everything at once, and she understood it completely, as she understood most of him by now, and she said, "It's just what I see," in a tone that was matter-of-fact and also quietly, unmistakably tender, and went back to her weeding. He stood at the edge of the garden in the afternoon sun for another moment, and then he went to help her, pulling weeds in the row alongside hers, and they worked in silence, which was not empty, which was never empty between them, which was by this point one of the primary languages they shared. It was in the spring of 1886 that the final, significant thing happened, which was not a crisis, but was rather the completion of something that had been unfinished for a long time. Louis had been 11 years old when he watched his father write a letter that he never sent a letter to Louis's grandfather, from whom his father had been estranged for reasons that were never fully explained to Louis as a boy, and which he had carried into adulthood as a small, persistent incompletion. His grandfather had died in 1870, 2 years after Louis lost his voice, before Louis had thought to find him and see what could be resolved between them. His father had died in 1878, a year before Louis came to Caldwell, and had also left things unresolved. What Louis had never told anyone, not even Lucy, or not in full, was that, before the fever that took his voice, he had been a talker. Not in Lucy's magnificent and warm-filling-every-room way, but in the ordinary way of a young man who had not yet learned what he was or was not. He had been loud sometimes, and careless with words, and had said things that were unkind because they were convenient, and had failed to say things that were important because saying them required a stillness he had not yet developed. The fever which had taken so much had also, over time and without his initial cooperation, given him back himself, a version of himself that was quieter and more deliberate, and, he thought honestly, better than the one before, though he would not have chosen the price. He wrote this out in a long letter that he had been composing over several months, adding to it in the evenings at the kitchen table while Lucy worked on her own writing at the desk across the room, and when it was finished, he gave it to her one Sunday morning without introduction or explanation. She read it over her coffee, and he watched her read it the way you watch a person open something you have left for them, not watching the thing, watching them. When she finished, she set it down and looked at him for a long moment. "You were happy," she said, "before, but you weren't quite yourself." He nodded. "And now you are." He nodded again. She reached across the table and put her hand over her ink-stained fingers, his rope-calloused ones, the turquoise ring on her hand catching the morning light from the east window. "I'm glad the fever didn't kill you," she said plainly, and then with only slightly less plainness. "And I'm glad you came to Caldwell, even though you would have been all right wherever you went because you're that kind of person. I'm glad it was here." He turned his hand over and held hers properly, and they sat at the kitchen table in the Sunday morning light with the house quiet around them, Samuel still asleep, Alina making some small exploratory sound from her room, and it was one of those moments that were not exceptional in any visible way, and that both of them would remember for the rest of their lives. The summer of 1886 was a good summer. The horse operation had its best year, a run of 6 foals from his 3 mares that were everything he had aimed for, and he sold 2 of them to ranchers as far away as Colorado at prices that made Luther Dunmore whistle and shake his head. Lucy's piece on land rights was picked up by a paper in Kansas City and prompted a letter from a woman's civic organization in Topeka who wanted to know if she would come and speak to their members. And she went in July and took Samuel, who was 4 years old, and regarded the trip to Topeka with a seriousness that was very much his father's and an excitement that was very much his mother's. They came back with 3 new books, a bolt of blue fabric, and Samuel's announcement that he intended to be either a lawyer or a horse trainer when he grew up, which Lucy told Lewis at supper with a tone of amusement and a side-eye at Alina, who was in her first interested months of pulling herself upright on every available surface, and who managed, at that moment, to pull herself upright on the leg of Lewis's chair and look up at him with an expression of profound and unfounded confidence that made him reach down and lift her up to sit in his lap with a care so practiced and natural that Lucy thought, as she often thought watching him with the children, that this was the most fluent he ever was in his hands. Alina looked at him from her perch in his lap with her mother's direct brown eyes and grabbed his nose with both hands, and he went cross-eyed trying to see her, and Samuel laughed so hard he fell off his chair, and Lucy put her face in her hands for a moment, and then looked up at Lewis across the table over her hands, laughing, and he was laughing too, silent as always, but fully and completely there, his face entirely undone by it, which she saw so rarely and which moved her every time. Running Wolf came through Caldwell in September with his usual group, and Lewis met with him at the edge of town the morning after his arrival, which had become a custom. Lewis brought coffee, which he handed over without words, and Running Wolf received it in kind, and they sat on a log near the South Creek in the early morning and communicated in the way they had developed over 3 years, a combination of the simple sign language Lewis had picked up from his time in the territory, and the bits of English that Running Wolf used comfortably, and the significant portion of their conversation that required neither, which was Lewis's particular facility. Running Wolf had brought, this visit, a small carved wooden bird for Alina, who was almost 1, and a piece of quill work for Samuel, and nothing for Lewis and Lucy because he had once, 2 years ago, brought them something and Lewis had responded with a generosity that had embarrassed them both, and the unspoken agreement since then was that the gifts were for the children. This was understood and appreciated. Lucy came down to the creek mid-morning to bring more coffee and to talk, which she did with Running Wolf in the combination of English and gesture that was their language, and which she had worked at because she was the kind of person who worked at things that mattered to her, and which Running Wolf engaged in with the patient precision of a man who respected effort and had no use for condescension. They spoke about the land, always the ongoing and worsening situation of the Cheyenne, and all the others for whom the government's promises were as reliable as weather. And Lucy wrote down what he said and told him it would go in the paper, and he nodded with the particular expression of a man who has long since stopped expecting that written words would change the large facts, but who understood that the written record mattered anyway, that someone needed to keep it, and that this woman was one of the few who would. When Running Wolf and his group left the next morning, Lewis stood at the edge of town and watched them go south, and he felt the thing he always felt when they departed, which was a specific and unresolvable grief about what this country had done and continued to do, and a respect for the endurance that continued past the grief. He came home and sat at the kitchen table and wrote about it, and showed it to Lucy, and she read it and said she wanted to use parts of it in the column, and he nodded. "I'll credit it to you," she said. He shook his head. "Lewis, you should have credit for your own writing," he wrote. "Use it for what it needs to do. The credit doesn't matter." She looked at him for a moment and then said quietly, "You are the best person I know." He wrote back quickly, "That's because you know me specifically. I'm not especially good in general." She burst out laughing, which was what he had intended, and the heaviness of the morning lifted, as it usually did between them, by the simple force of her laugh and his ability, after 7 years, to time a thing correctly. They had one more child, born in 1888, another son. They named him Thomas after no one in particular, just a name they both liked, which felt like a luxury, to name a child simply for the sound of it. Thomas was 3 years younger than Samuel and 3 years older than Alina would be when he arrived, and he was from the first the temperament between his parents, not as loud as Samuel, not as focused as Alina, but warmly and happily in the middle of everything, a sociable and contented boy who seemed to find the world exactly as it should be and greeted it accordingly. Lewis held Thomas on the evening of his arrival, the September light coming long and golden through the east bedroom window, and looked at this third child with the accumulation of everything. All the years since the ride to Caldwell, the lending library and bleak house, and the walk on Macon Street and the folded note, and the turquoise ring and the August moonlight, and the note on the first page of the notebook that said, "Will you marry me?" and everything after, and he thought what he had thought when Samuel arrived, which had not diminished with repetition. How extraordinary it was, in a life that had been largely lived in silence, to have arrived here. Lucy came in from the kitchen where she had been drinking tea with Margaret Dunmore, who had come to help and had not been ready to leave, and she found Lewis sitting with Thomas in the window light, and she stood in the doorway watching them for a moment before he heard her and looked up. She smiled at him, just that, the full direct smile that was hers alone. He reached for the notebook on the bedside table with one hand, Thomas still secure in the other arm, and wrote one-handed and passed it to her. She read it. "I keep thinking I've arrived, and then it gets better." She came across the room and sat beside him on the edge of the bed and leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at Thomas, who was regarding the ceiling with the unfocused wonder of the newly arrived, and she said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing to add. He put his arm around her, Thomas in the crook of one arm and Lucy against the other side, and the September evening came through the window gold and slow, and outside the house on the edge of Caldwell, the Kansas grassland went on and on to the horizon in every direction, and the plains were exactly as they had always been, enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful. And inside the house, in the specific warmth of that small room, Lewis Barker held everything that mattered to him in both arms and was silent, as he always was, and full, as he had not always been, and home, which was the word that meant all of the above and which, if he had thought about it, was the first word he had tried to write when the fever finally broke in that Missouri winter, and the doctor handed him a piece of paper and said, "Son, I think you had better learn to use this." The word he had written, alone on a cold morning with his whole future changed and his voice gone and his body still rebuilding itself from the inside out, had been home. He had not known then where it was. He had spent 11 years finding it, riding the country from the Missouri River to the New Mexico territory, watching the plains from horseback in every kind of weather, learning in the long silence what he was and was not, what he needed and what he could carry. And then he had ridden into Caldwell, Kansas, on a spring morning in 1879, and heard a woman talking to an old man about the correct placement of a hinge display, and something in him had gone entirely and completely still, the way the land goes still before a good rain, and he had understood, though he did not have the word for it yet, that he was close. In the last light of the September evening, with Thomas between them and Lucy's head on his shoulder, and the house quiet around its ordinary warmth, Lewis Barker was home, completely and without remainder, and it was everything the word had always meant when he wrote it alone on that piece of paper in the Missouri winter, and considerably more besides. And outside the window, the Kansas sky was doing what it did best, which was going on forever in every direction without apology, holding the last of the day's light in the west in colors so large and uncontained that they seemed to have forgotten, as the sky sometimes did, that the appropriate thing was modesty. Lewis looked at it for a moment over Lucy's head, the big red and gold of the September sunset, the first star already present in the east, the grassland below it all going silver in the fading light, and he thought that if he could have said one word to describe what his life had become, he would have used the same word he had used at the beginning, the first word he had ever written: home. And it would have been, as all his words were, exactly right.